Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about understanding vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So first of all, what are vasoconstriction and vasodilation? Well, if we imagine a blood vessel at rest at an intermediate state, such as in the top of the slide here, it has a certain diameter, and that diameter can be decreased, and that would be vasoconstriction. We constrict the blood vessel by contracting the smooth muscle rings around it and decrease the space, the inner diameter, the space for blood flow inside it. Or we can do the opposite. We can vasodilate it, relax that smooth muscle, and allow for more space for blood to flow inside that blood vessel. So the result is a change in blood flow. And as we'll see later, this change in blood flow is even larger than it would appear based on the change in diameter of that vessel. Okay, so how this works is that capillary beds, so all the places where oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and wastes are exchanged at all in your body, regulation of blood flow to those capillary beds is based on the smooth muscle rings on the arterioles that are carrying blood to those capillary beds. So if you have a particular tissue or organ and you constrict the arterioles leading into it by contracting the smooth muscle around those arterioles, then that whole tissue or organ is going to get less blood flow. And vice versa, of course, for vasodilation. Okay, how does this work? This is primarily under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system often acts antagonistically with the parasympathetic nervous system, but in this case, most of the vasoconstriction and vasodilation that occur, although not all of them, but most of that activity is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. The difference, the way we get vasoconstriction at some tissues and vasodilation at others, and we'll see an example of that in just a moment, is because there are different receptor types within that system. Primarily, we will get vasoconstriction when there are alpha receptors, alpha adrenergic receptors present on the tissue, and vasodilation when there are beta receptors that are present on that tissue. Okay, so let's look at an example. If we look at just blood flow at rest here, and we think about how much blood per unit size are all these tissues getting, you can see that number under the name of the tissue. So the heart at rest getting 70 milliliters per 100 grams per minute, and so on. If you look at these numbers in total, you'll see the kidney is crushing it down there, 400 milliliters per 100 grams per minute. The kidney's job is to filter blood, of course, and to do so, your entire blood volume 50 times a day. So it gets a tremendous amount of blood flow at rest. And then your digestive tract and liver are next. Again, they require a lot of blood flow for all of the digestion and absorption and metabolic activity that those organs carry out. But if we were going to begin to exercise, we would see that things will change. So if you see at rest, skeletal muscle only gets 5 milliliters per 100 grams per minute compared to the 400 that kidneys get. In fact, the situation can essentially reverse during exercise. We redistribute blood from the tissues that were using it when we were resting, the kidney, the digestive tract, and so on, and we're redistributing it to the tissues that need much more blood flow, much more oxygen and glucose and waste removal during exercise. And that's primarily the heart and the skeletal muscles. So you can see the tremendous changes here. The kidneys have decreased their blood flow by an order of magnitude. They're receiving now, 10 times-ish less blood than before. The digestive tract receiving far less. The heart has doubled its amount of blood flow that it's receiving. And the skeletal muscle is orders of magnitude higher blood flow that it's receiving. Another example is when you're overheated, when your body is too hot, the way it's going to get rid of that heat is either by radiating it off the skin or by sweating, or both typically. And both of those ways of offloading heat require more blood flow to the skin. And so in this situation, we can see that the blood flow to the digestive tract and kidneys went down, not quite as much. And then the blood flow to the skin went up again by more than an order of magnitude, more than 10 times greater in this situation. So if we look at these situations, the idea to really take away is that there's only so much blood flow. There's only so much blood to distribute. You can't just run around your house opening all the faucets, or you're going to see decreased pressure in that entire system. You're not going to be able to supply flow to everywhere at once. And it's the same in the body. If we're going to exercise, we need to take blood flow away from digestive organs and deliver it to the muscles and the heart. And then once exercise starts making you warm, to your skin. So we want to be able to redistribute blood in that situation. And this is essentially why you can't exercise vigorously right after you eat, because there's only so much blood flow to go around, and we can't expect both your intestines and your skeletal muscles to be working at maximal capacity at the same time. There just aren't the resources to do that. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, I see why you would want to redistribute blood, but won't the blood go faster if I constrict the vessel? Isn't that better rather than worse? So the confusion that you're having here is that you're mixing up velocity with blood flow. Blood flow is the total amount of blood, or fluid if we're comparing it to a garden hose, that's passing at a certain time. So when you constrict the end of that garden hose in order to spray your sibling with water, you're increasing the speed, which is what you want, because you want the water to hit your sibling with some force, but you're decreasing the amount of water that's coming out of that hose per unit time. Consider a mountain stream, like on the upper left here, versus a river, like on the bottom right, that's very wide. If you put a leaf into each of these bodies of water, well, the leaf is going to fly down the mountain stream and just drift down the river. So the stream is moving faster, but the total amount of water passing any given point per unit time is much greater in the river, right? Because the river is much wider and much deeper and has just much more water in it. So that's what we're thinking of when we're thinking of changing blood vessel diameter. As we increase blood vessel diameter, we're making it more like this wide, deep river where a whole lot of blood can pass per unit time. So we're looking not for speed, that doesn't really matter in terms of blood flow. We're looking for the amount of blood that passes per unit time. Okay, so faster blood flow in a constricted vessel, but we don't really care. We want to deliver more blood because the more blood you deliver, the more oxygen it has, the more ability it has to remove carbon dioxide, the more glucose it's delivering, and so on. Okay, so we know that we can constrict or dilate blood, and that's going to deliver blood flow to different tissues. But what if, instead of constricting some vessels and dilating others, we just constricted or dilated all of them? If we sort of globally had the same effect on most or many of the blood vessels in the body. Well, this has a different role. So if we take most of the blood vessels in the body and constrict them, then what we're doing is we're saying, okay, amount of blood in the body, you now have fewer places to go, right? Just think of all those arterioles closing off blood flow to those capillary beds. There's less area, less volume, less space for that blood to spread out in. So now you have the same amount of blood in less space, right? And so what we've done here is increase the blood pressure. Blood pressure is just the force of blood against the walls of the arteries. And if you've constricted where it's going to press harder against the walls of those arteries. So vasoconstriction, broadly, is a tool that we can use to increase our blood pressure when it's too low. And vice versa, when the blood pressure is too high, we can decrease it with vasodilation. Now, the mechanism by which this works is by something that we call resistance, all right? So resistance just means how hard is it for the blood to flow through the vessel? Now, if we looked into this in detail, this has to do with with fluid dynamics, with essentially the physics of how fluids flow through tubes. But fundamentally, what's happening here is that the more you constrict the vessel, the less the blood can flow in a nice laminar, lined up, smooth way through that vessel, and the more that you see disordered movement of the molecules of the fluid as they flow through. So that as you shrink the blood vessel, you're making it harder for blood to flow through, and less is going to go through per unit time. Well, blood pressure is only determined by two things: the amount of blood that's coming out of your heart, and then the resistance to that blood flow once it's out. So the amount of blood coming out of your heart per unit time is the cardiac output. And then by changing the resistance, just by changing the amount of total vasoconstriction out there, we can change the blood pressure. So if you're dehydrated, you don't have much blood volume, today haven't had much chance to drink some water, maybe you've been losing some water through talking or donating blood or sweating, then your blood volume is down, then one tool to maintain your blood pressure, keep you from collapsing into a heap on the floor, is this vasoconstriction. And the opposite, right? If your blood pressure is high, for any of a whole wide variety of reasons, then vasodilation broadly can help control blood pressure. Blood pressure is a very highly regulated variable, and there's really just two quick tools that can adjust it: resistance and heart rate. And those two will change to keep your blood pressure in the right range to keep you operating. Now, one of the coolest things about this is that this change in diameter does not cause a linear change in resistance. Because physics, essentially, when you take a blood vessel and you reduce its diameter by half, as I've shown on the bottom here, well, we can see that resistance is related to the diameter or radius of the blood vessel by the inverse fourth power. So that when you decrease the radius by half, you're actually decreasing the blood flow through that vessel by 16 times. So there are other things that determine resistance, but they're not things that change in the short term. So it's really the radius that's going to change that. And so vasoconstriction and vasodilation are what's going to control the ability of blood to flow through all these vessels. And so the cool thing about that fourth power relationship is that you can get these huge changes in blood flow that we saw before with a relatively small change in blood vessel diameter. So relatively small input of ATP into this situation, energetically it's not very costly to make these huge changes in blood flow around the body, and that's really neat. Okay, so broadly speaking then, we have two functions of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Its role for different tissues and organs is to distribute blood appropriately, based on your activity, to the tissues and organs that need it by allowing more or less blood flow through those arterioles. Globally, we can vasoconstrict or vasodilate in order to control your blood pressure, and specifically the MAP, the mean arterial blood pressure, around the entire body. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Let me know what questions you have.